Hey guys, what's going on? It's Ash here coming at you today in Clash Royale. I am so excited to be joined by Colton again. Colton, welcome back to the channel, man. How you doing?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for having me again.
It's a pleasure to have you as always, Colton. It's been too long, man. I miss you. How's your channel going and everything?
Going pretty well. This week has been busy. I have both midterms and 8 days of CCGS.
Wow.
So busy, but as soon as it's all over, I'll get back to making videos.
And how you doing?
I've got a top 8 and a top 16 finish in CCGS, and midterms are approaching, so we'll see.
All right, all right. Well, the good luck, and the reason that we have you on today is to talk about something that I've never actually made a dedicated video for in Clash Royale. And in my opinion, you're one of the best teachers out there. If you guys haven't checked out Colton's YouTube channel, you need to check it out. Trust me, guys. Not just saying that because he's on, but he's one of the best teachers in the game, honestly. So I have him on to talk about card cycling in rotation. And it's something that you've heard both me and Colton and other YouTubers mention a lot, but we never took a deep dive because I think it's truly an advanced topic and it's kind of hard to articulate at times. Basically, the order that you drop your cards really matters in a match of Clash Royale, sometimes even when you don't think it matters. So we're going to be talking about that. We're also going to be talking about cycling in general. This ought to be a really good conversation for you guys who are looking for advanced tips on how to up your gameplay. So Colton, why don't you start us off by just talking about cycling and what it is, just a basic kind of overview.
Yeah, so the general concept behind cycling is your opponent typically has one or two defenses that they use primarily to stop your offense. So let's say they have an Inferno Tower, you have a Hog. They play down Inferno Tower, their Inferno traits for your Hog, but then you have these cards that cycle really quick, and you can get back to your Hog before they can get back to their Inferno Tower, and that guarantees damage. So that's the basic concept, but in practice, it's actually much more complicated, and it ties into like baiting out spells, saving certain cards for your defense, and not using certain cards so that you can use them on offense and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to start this conversation. I mean, just a quick example of why cycle or the order that you place your cards really does matter. Just to start things out, and then we'll kind of maybe we'll start at the beginning of a match and what your mentality should be. But, you know, it's something as simple as when you're dropping a Hog Rider on the bridge and you want to combo it with, say, an Ice Spirit, it would really behoove the attacker to drop the Hog Rider first. That way you'd have that 1 elixir cost Ice Spirit to help cycle back to the Hog Rider quicker on the next rotation. And that's actually a big deal. It might sound like a minor thing. Can you think of any other examples along those lines, Colton?
In terms of, so yeah, you play if you're going to do a cycle deck like that, unless it's needed for offense. So something Miner does is it'll play the Ice Spirit at the bridge first because it tanks shots from the Miner and then freezes tower, or it forces a response. But yeah, for Hog, if you want to get back to it faster, you can play it first. For cycle, other things are like, don't ever, so if you're playing against Spellbait and you really need Log to defend Goblin Barrel, don't log a Princess, that type of stuff. So that because if you do that, not only will you not have it for that time, you won't have it for that time, and then it can possibly mess up your rotation to where you're forced to like log Goblin Gang and Princess or something, but you always want to have it in the hand at the time that your opponent is getting to the card that you need the counter for.
Exactly, and that's where you can find yourself in a bad rotation. So another part of this video is going to be how to keep a good rotation for yourself and how to force your opponent into an awkward situation where they never really have their counter in hand. And another thing I should note now, Colton, is that like card order and rotation matters whether or not you're playing a typical cycle fast deck or not. Like even if you're playing like a really heavy deck like Golem Beatdown, I think it's, you know, worth noting that, you know, you have to think about what counters your opponent has and not using them or not letting your opponent bait them out when you don't want them to. So I guess a good example of that would be if they're going to counter your Golem with a minion horde and you're playing Executioner, your opponent, a savvy opponent, might drop something like regular minions or something in the opposite lane trying to bait out your Executioner. So is there any way that you can kind of give a few tips on how to kind of be aware when your opponent's trying to bait out something and how not to let it happen to you?
Yeah, so especially when... So you always want to save your counter for the highest threat. So if you're playing against someone that has minions and minion horde, let's say they do a little push with, like, I don't know, just an example is, let's say they push with minor minions, and their defense they'll have minion horde for your main push. So if you have executioner, instead of using executioner on those minions, you can instead, let's say you have cycle cards. Instead, you can use skeletons on the minor, and then just ice spirit on the minions, pull them into the middle, and then maybe like some other card if you have to. But ideally, you take some damage in that situation, because there's really something to be said about taking some damage. You should never play to prevent all damage at a game. You're always going to take some damage if your opponent isn't just awful. But now, when you go on offense with your golem, like you were saying, you can back it up with an executioner, and he can't use minion horde because it'll die. Or if it does, I'm assuming you probably have tornado, so you just tornado it into the executioner. So that really gives you an opportunity to make a bigger push in the future, even though you took a little bit of damage on defense.
That's a great point. And that's something I really wanted folks to get out of this conversation. And it's something that I do too. And it's something that I think a lot of the top players in the game really craftily and artfully do, to almost to the point where if you're watching a replay on my channel or your channel, or even like on a stream, sometimes you don't even realize they're doing it because it's so subtle at times. But I mean, I guess another way to put it would be, why making a non-value trade or using your secondary counter, even if you have your best counter for something in hand, will actually pay off for you in the long run. Another example of that is on the Three Musketeer deck that I like so much, that you actually coached me on, Colton, so thank you for that.
No problem.
But you know what I do is sometimes is if I'm playing against a bait deck, for example, and I have log in hand, but I know that their best counter to my Battle Ram or my Three Musketeer push is a Goblin Gang, sometimes I'll just go ahead and use a skeleton or something, or an Ice Spirit against the Goblin Barrel, even if I have the log in hand, so I can better use my log on offense against the Goblin Bang as a predictive play, a Goblin Gang as a predictive play there. So that's like an example of why sometimes not using your best counter is better in the long run. So taking a little bit of damage, to your point, is often a really good play. Are there any other examples like that you have, or any rules of thumb that you kind of use as to when that's a good thing and when that's maybe a little bit too risky?
Yeah, so it's too risky when you're like countering a Goblin Gang with a knight by himself, because you're always going to give up like 500 damage or something. It comes down to whether your second counter denies enough damage or not. So ideal second counters to Goblin Gang or skeletons. Ice Spirit does a decent job of stopping one goblin, but a good combo is like you can knight in the back and then skeletons in the front, and that'll deny all damage. Like if you do that little combo. Electro Whiz, if you know the perfect timing, if you use an Electro Whiz to zap all three goblins on the inside of a tower. That was in like my latest video. If people don't understand what I'm saying, you can hit all three goblins with the zap, and the Electro Whiz will shock the two the tower doesn't hit. So that's another way to trade with a Goblin Gang. And these things like all allow you to save your log, or maybe you're playing against someone that has minions and you have arrows. So instead of using arrows on the minions, you use it on the minion horde on offense. Or if you're playing like a Lava Hound deck and they have Minion Horde and Goblin Gang or Goblin Barrel, you just counter Goblin Gang or Barrel with skeletons, and then you arrow the Minion Horde on offense with your Lava Hound. And then the final example would be a deck I like is the Hog, Tornado, Executioner, Lightning deck. So if they do something like a swarm unit goes on offense against me, I'll lure it into the middle instead of logging it. That way I have my log available on offense. And this goes for like any spells too. Like if they could give me, maybe they give me lightning value, so I won't go on offense again because I know he has Inferno. So if I defend with lightning, I can't go on offense until I have lightning back in rotation, or I have to hold that lightning and use it on offense. Stuff like that.
Okay, yeah, there's so many decisions like this that we go through in one match, no matter what deck you're using. So that's why it's so important to think about what you're using, and if your opponent's trying to bait that out, even like you said, even if it's a lightning or something, like sometimes it's not always a bait deck per se. Like, you know, sometimes even beatdown decks can be bait decks. So it's really important to stay aware. I kind of want to kind of rewind to the beginning of a match, Colton. And a lot of people, myself included, you included, I'm sure, they'll start out a game just by cycling. So by playing their cheap cards, you know, 1 to 3 elixir cards in the back of their king tower, either split or even at the bridge in like an ice spear or something like that. Why do people do that, A? And B, is that ever a mistake? For example, if I have a starting hand, if I'm playing a 3 Musketeer deck, and I have 3 Musketeers, log and a battle ram or something, and in a, you know, like, I guess that's a bad example, but I'm guessing why do people cycle is a better place to start with the conversation, I guess.
So the reason people do it is because, well, there's a couple reasons. The main reason, though, is that if you play a cheap card, your opponent won't want to leak Elixir, so they're going to have to play a card too. And there's a decent chance that if this is something you do and your opponent doesn't, he'll play a card that's expensive, and that allows you many more options. You can either set up your own unit in the back, in order, and that'll allow his unit will, say I start skeletons at the back, he starts knight at the back, and then his knight will actually reach my side of the bridge before my knight that I placed after my skeletons will, because he placed it 1 second earlier. And that'll allow the tower to kill it, and my knight will continue on offense, and I can use it. That's one scenario. Another is just there's a very real thing of playing cycle cards to not reveal your deck and trying to learn what your opponent's deck is. This is the same reason you should never start a win condition at the start of a game, because what if you play a hog and your opponent has Electro Whiz in hand? If they play skeletons with it, the hog gets no hits, or the hog gets only 1 hit and they have an Electro Whiz on the field, so they're basically up 4 elixir.
So you're never playing your win condition ever as the first play?
Not unless my hand absolutely is terrible. Like if my hand is Tornado, Log, Lightning, Hog, then
that's what I was trying to come up with before. A terrible hand. Yeah.
Okay. So unless you have a terrible hand, you should always be starting with safe cards that allow you to fill out your opponent. And this is something that basically every player at the top does. The only other situation is like maybe sometimes you start a game with a Lava Hound at the back, but once again, it's only when you have a terrible hand, because otherwise you can get hard rushed in the opposite lane and be punished because you just played a 7 elixir card that's going to take 20 seconds to be of any value to you.
Yeah, so many times the first plays or the first like exchanges, I guess, of the game are the ones that will lose you or win you sometimes a match. So I want to talk about one last thing before I let you go, Colton, and that is when it's a smart move to make a negative elixir trade. I said it, a negative elixir trade. So OJ would be disappointed at me in saying this, or at bringing up this topic, but is it ever a good idea to intentionally make a negative elixir trade to set yourself up for a future push or future defense?
Yeah, so it absolutely is. In some situations, obviously, for the most part, you want to counter things with a positive elixir trade because you get more elixir from it and you can use that in future pushes. But in certain situations, it's good. So let's say you're playing, this is an example that's pretty good. So say you're playing, and this works probably best for bait decks, or not even bait decks, honestly. There's always, any deck can work well if you bait out their main counter to your push. Every deck has a push or a win condition, and if you can bait that out. So let's say I'm playing 3 Musketeers against a poison deck, and he stacks up, or he has like a push coming. So I already have 1 pump down. I decide to play the 3 Musketeers all in the middle. They won't split because they're all going to be defending, but say they kill off the push, but he poisons it, they all die. Now I can play another pump down, and he won't have poison up to punish it. So even though I took, I don't know, like a -3 elixir trade if I killed off a push with it, I'm now going to have an elixir momentum, and he's either going to be, his push has died, so he's either going to have to start something at the back that's like not optimal, or he's going to have to rush me with something that's not optimal, and he won't have his poison up. So if he graveyards, for example, to try to punch the pump, then I'll just be able to play Goblin Gang down and get a positive elixir trade on my defense. So it's really just something about like baiting out spells, whether you're playing a spell bait deck or anything really, and using it to your advantage to get your opponent out of rotation.
Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense too. And like, I guess I can't think of another example off the top of my head, although it's one of those things that just happens a lot naturally. But I think that you kind of hit the nail on the head in terms of oftentimes you will do a negative elixir trade on purpose to set up a pump. Like, I think that's oftentimes, at least in my experience, that's been the scenario, right? Where, okay, I'll play this to bait out a spell. That way I know my pump is safe. Or same thing with Three Musketeers. Like, sometimes I'll play Three Musketeers in the same lane, even if I know they have lightning in hand, and I'll play them with like the Crown Tower kind of as a lightning rod for one musketeer. And then if they use it, then I'll take I'll try to cut my losses. But what I'm trying to do is save up another 4 elixir to get that battle ram down to act as the real lightning rod, you know? So it's like kind of a bait game there. But I think that it just really is a subtle but important thing in terms of sometimes knowing either to take damage or to make a negative trade to really set you up in the future. Any other common tips or mistakes that people make, especially maybe people who are just kind of starting out or mid-level arenas in terms of rotations and just knowing what to play and when to play it?
Yeah, so I was really hoping you would ask this actually. So I see a common mistake at lower levels I see is people will play things like Inferno Tower or Cannon, their defense basically, against something that isn't necessarily a negative elixir trade, but it does lose them games. So say someone plays a bowler and you play Inferno Tower, and that's your main defense against their win condition. Or maybe you don't know what their win condition is yet. Maybe he's only played bowler to start the game and you counter with Inferno Tower. Yes, it is a neutral elixir trade, but now they can play hog and you have no defense available. And now for the rest of the game, unless you cycle back to it or you do another defense without using an Inferno Tower, so basically he gets 2 free hogs, you're now going to take a bunch of damage because you don't have your main defense against hog in hand. And that's just one example, and every deck is different. But there's really a thing to be said about saving your defense, even though it's not necessarily a bad trade, because it's more important to counter their win condition than it is support troops.
That's a really good point. I think that saving defenses and saving spells early on is probably a good move if you have a secondary option in hand. If you have no option, then of course you have to do what you have to do.
Yeah.
But, you know, you're right, because a bowler is not a win condition. You know, it's a support troop. So using your Inferno Tower against a bowler, not only does it leave you vulnerable to that hog push or whatever they might really have as their win condition, but it also will screw you up the entire game like you just touched on there. I mean, because next time they have their hog in rotation, you're probably not going to have the Inferno Tower again, or you're going to have the Inferno Tower at all the wrong times. So that's when you really screw yourself up, like later on in the match. Is there any like rule of thumb as to when, are you basically just looking to scout out your opponent's deck totally before you're comfortable at choosing what counter is going to be used where?
Yeah, so I mean, so there are situations where you use Inferno Tower against bowler, but it would be against a deck like Splash Yard to where they have graveyard, so you're allowed to use Inferno Tower on their baby dragon and their bowler. But it's really varies, because you don't want to use Inferno Tower against a bowler if they're going to be using something like Golem or Giant or Hog. So it's really situational, and that's why you play early games. No really good player is going to gamble. They're not going to start the game with a win condition. They're not going to start by using Inferno Tower against an unoptimal troop. They're going to wait and see what their opponent's cards are and memorize them and memorize their rotation, which easier said than done. But they do these things in order to hedge their bets, to make themselves have the best possible chance at winning, because no really good player wants to gamble. They don't want to leave it up to luck. They want to figure out what their opponent's deck is, and then know the adequate ways to defend it. And at the top level play, decks start to become optimal. So you see certain decks every single time, and once you see 2 or 3 cards, if you're a good player and you have all the decks memorized, you'll recognize that deck and immediately know what you can do and what you can't do throughout a match. But that's really the things that we have in mind as we go through a match. It's not just playing cards when you see other cards. It's recognizing things and adequately defending and playing in certain ways against certain matchups.
Yeah, and even if you know, or like people, especially in lower to mid-level arenas, and even sometimes early on in challenge matches, some people will be playing like weird, strange decks, like unorthodox decks. I mean, at the top of ladder, it's easy to kind of to identify early on what deck exactly your opponent's playing because they're mostly playing tier 1 decks up there. But it's a little bit different, especially, or like I said, early on in challenges and mid-level arenas. Are there any, I guess what you would fall back on, and correct me if you disagree, is just the general archetype that they're playing in terms of what you're going to try to anticipate. Even if it's kind of a weird deck, they're still going to be using a win condition. You kind of base things off that. Is that kind of correct?
Yeah, I mean, every deck is
That didn't sound
different,
too convincing.
especially lower levels. Oh, well, I mean, so, I mean, different archetypes can have different win conditions, though. Like, I've seen Beatdown with Goblin Barrel. I've seen control decks that have, like, P.E.K.K.A. in them. So, it really just, you just have to feel it out, honestly. If you don't recognize the deck immediately, then you just have to don't play sort of slow. Like, you can go on offense, you can take certain defensive trades, but make sure you keep in mind what their true win condition is at the end of the game. You should figure it out pretty quickly, so.
All right, cool, man. Well, I think this has been a valuable conversation. Certainly talking about things that are kind of, higher level concepts that, good players do. And I think these are some of the things that can frustrate players because there are things that not everybody grasps. Like, for example, if you are playing a cycle deck, you want to use your win condition before the cycle card. That way you can cycle back to it. Or when to make a negative elixir trade. Or when not to use the best counter that you have for a given win condition, even if you have it in hand, like we talked about with the log and the goblin barrel. So I think that you added tons of valuable advice there. Hopefully you guys can go ahead and apply that to your own game and maybe, increase your personal best by a few hundred trophies. Colton, any final words for us today?
Clash on.
Clash on. Clash on, Colton. Good luck in the global series, and you're definitely one of my favorite guys in the community. Certainly, a lot of people, kind of bitch and moan about how negative the community is, but it's so great to have guys like you. Honestly, this is such a love fest. Here I am, but it's good to have guys like you, honestly, who are just genuinely out there, who are passionate about the game, and just want to help people. So thanks for being that guy in the community, man.
Oh, thanks to you too, man. Try my best.
Well, you do a great job. So again, thanks to Colton. Check out his information in the description below. Really appreciate this conversation. Really appreciate all you guys watching. It means the world to me. I want to give a shout out to my YouTube partner, Bren Chong. You can find his information in the description as well. Guys, thank you so much. And as always, take care, guys.